class. So I'm breaking up the information about climate change because it's kind of a lot. I would usually cover this over several class periods because I think it's so important to understand all the aspects of it so that you can kind of weed through the information that people might give you and understand the science behind it. So this short lecture will be an introduction to what is climate, our atmosphere, and kind of an introduction to the issue of climate change. So here we go. So one thing that I think is important to distinguish is the difference between weather and climate. A lot of times you might see a social media post or someone might tell you, I don't believe in climate change because look, today it's snowing, and it's not usually this cold at this time of year, or they might have some other example of an anomaly, something that they think that disproves climate change or global warming. So what's going on is an overall warming of the Earth on average. So global warming is talking about the overall warming of the Earth on average over a long time span. So climate is something that you're going to live in different climate zones. I mean, our climate zone or the climate zone in like North America, like New York or Chicago, would definitely be much different than the climate zone in the Caribbean. So you can live in different climate zones. So climate is talking about the overall trends in weather over time, kind of like an overall, what could the weather be? Like what is the overall average for that region? But additionally, we can have climate of the entire Earth changing overall. So the overall average of the Earth is changing. Whereas weather is more of a seasonal or like an individual thing. Like you would talk about the weather for a particular day, but you talk about the climate over the course of years. So the climate's more of an overall average. So someone explained it to me once. I thought it was pretty interesting that weather will tell you what to wear that day. So you might check the weather so that you know what to wear that day, whether to wear boots or a rain jacket or a coat or a hat. But climate is going to determine your wardrobe, what you have for your climate zone. So for example, if you do live in the northern US, you might have a coat. You might also have a swimsuit and goggles because maybe it's warm enough in the summer to swim in the lakes. You might own a swimsuit, you might own a coat, mittens, boots, so you might be prepared for quite a wide variety, whereas someone who lives in northern Alaska, they might not even own a swimsuit. It might not be a useful thing for them to have in their wardrobe. Someone who lives in the Caribbean might not own mittens. I doubt they would. My sister-in-law lives in Florida, and she was planning to go to Alaska, so she borrowed a lot of long johns and mittens and boots from me for her trip. So if you live in Florida, you might not even own mittens or a warm hat or anything like that. So different climate zone. So that might help you out with that, distinguishing climate from weather. There's also two different terms that you might hear on a regular basis, global warming versus climate change. And people today tend to use the term climate change more because that's more of a broad term. It includes more changes that are happening on Earth. But global warming is the increase of the Earth's average surface temperature. And so this is due to buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Those gases usually contain carbon, so we often talk about carbon gases like CO2 and methane. So global warming is the overall increase, and the Earth's surface temperature on average is increasing. So global warming is happening. Climate change is more of a broad term. This includes global warming, but it also includes changes in the climate other than just temperature. Precipitation is the big one. Like there's areas that are getting more dry or getting more rain and more snow than they used to. So climate change is a broader term. I prefer the term climate change because a lot of people that are trying to disprove that this is happening might use examples from their life of times where it was colder than usual. And so they would say, well, global warming isn't happening, but you can say, well, no, that's the climate that's changing. So a lot of times with climate change, what we're actually seeing in particular areas of the Earth is that some areas that are cold are getting colder than they used to be. some areas that are already warm are getting warmer than they used to be. So not every area on the Earth is increasing in temperature. So that's kind of interesting thing, but it's the overall average of the Earth's temperature that has increased. So not every particular area. The atmospheric composition is kind of interesting. I never understood this until I took a scuba diving class, and you learn about mixing gases for your scuba tank. You want it to be the same as it would be breathing, at the surface of the Earth when you're diving underwater. So we learned a lot about gases, and it turns out that the atmosphere, like the air that we are breathing right now, is mostly made of nitrogen gas. So it's mostly this N2, almost 80%. This number is kind of covered up, but 78% of our gases is actually nitrogen gas. Let me see if I actually have this in here, major gases. And oxygen is, of course, a large percentage, but only about 20% of our gas is nitrogen, or oxygen, sorry, that we're breathing. And argon is a little bit as well. And then the other gases are much less than 1%, very minor. So the changes of CO2 and other gases has been, it's still a small amount, even though there's a large change. This is the molecule methane that you might hear us talking about, and this is carbon dioxide, of course, and this is water vapor, H2O. So those are some we might talk about. So the carbon of, let me go back a little bit, of methane and CO2 that we are seeing increasing in the atmosphere is coming from fossil fuels. And this is any kind of natural gas, gasoline, diesel, coal that we are burning to get energy, to get electricity. Of course, the gas in your car is fueling your car engine. So that's one of them, but the major ones are actually, the major emissions that's going into the atmosphere is actually from power plants powering electricity in your house or in the buildings that you use or the street lights outside. Our whole infrastructure is based on electricity from burning fossil fuels. And so it's important to know where these come from. And there's a misconception that these are from fossilized dinosaurs, and that's why the name is fossil fuels. But it's actually mostly from ancient plants and marine algae and plankton. And so coal is actually formed from the burial of rocks that have a lot of land plants. So coal is formed from ancient land plants. So some areas like Illinois used to have a lot of land plants in swampy areas, swampy environments. And those type of sedimentary rocks got buried underground, put under a lot of pressure, and that formed a rock called coal. And that's one of the, I need to learn how to write better. That's one of the fossil fuels that we burn for energy. The other large source is oil and gas, actually comes from marine algae and plankton. These are tiny, tiny, usually unicellular creatures that float on the surface of the ocean. And when they die, they sink to the bottom and add to the sediment, the sand and mud that's at the bottom of the sea. And it builds up in layers, and as it gets buried underneath the ocean floor, it forms oil and gas. So this is why a lot of oil is found under the ocean from drilling. And then other areas where you find oil, where you might be drilling for oil on land, those are places where it used to be under an ocean. So that's usually where that comes from. And the ages of these deposits are not when dinosaurs were living on Earth. These are very old mostly. The oil and gas is mostly from older deposits of sedimentary rocks from before dinosaurs had even evolved. So there's not a lot of dinosaurs in there. There's some oil that's been produced during the time of the dinosaurs, but since this is in the ocean, you don't usually find dinosaurs in the ocean. So there's not as much dinosaur deposits in the oil, but occasionally they do find dinosaur bones in an oil deposit, which can be pretty interesting. So all these things are, the marine algae and plankton or plants, they're all using energy from the sun initially. So if you want to think about it in kind of a fun way, then these fossil fuels are originally getting their energy from the sun, so it's kind of like solar power. Not really though, because solar power is not putting out all this extra carbon molecules into the atmosphere. But originally it's using photosynthesis to use CO2, and so that's why initially CO2 was used up, in photosynthesis to make these deposits and make these glucose molecules. And then those got buried, and since they've gotten buried under so much pressure, like a piece of coal, for example, would have a lot more carbon stored in it than like a pile of leaves of the same size. A lot more is being stored in that coal. So when we burn it, it's like a concentrated amount. It has a lot of CO2 that comes out. So when we burn it to make energy, the CO2 comes back out. So it's like a cycle. So we use fossil fuels because they're relatively cheap. That seems weird, right? Oil and gas is expensive. No, not compared to solar power in your car or having, solar panels or windmills in your yard to power your house. That would be much more expensive. We're also, the infrastructure is here. We already have power lines and everything set up to use fossil fuels, so it's very hard to go away from that. It seems like a great objective for our whole culture to switch to renewable energy, but it's not really feasible to do in a very short time. But of course, there's lots of environmental impacts and reasons why we shouldn't use fossil fuels. So hopefully over our lifetime we'll see a lot of changes. One thing that's interesting is that they thought that fossil fuels had a small life expectancy. This is something I've been learning for 15 years, that we're going to run out of oil and gas within 40 to 50 years and not have it anymore, not have any coal found in the ground. This has not been true, obviously, because we still have a lot being pulled out of the ground. That's because we have new technologies to allow us to get it out of the ground, but it's gotten more and more expensive, partially because we have to fund those new technologies, like horizontal drilling and fracking. Those types of things are really expensive to do. But they are non-renewable resources. We will eventually run out of sources that we can actually get out of the ground. So maybe it won't be in 50 years, maybe it will be. So we'll have to eventually switch. Hopefully we'll be ready and we won't just suddenly run out and have a panic, but we'll see. I discussed this a little bit when I talked about photosynthesis and CO2 being used up and then re-released, but the carbon cycle is really important to understand. And it's similar to the water cycle, where water goes in different forms and it goes in different ways, and we know about evaporation and rain, and it flows along the ground. That seems pretty intuitive. The carbon cycle is harder because we can't really see it. We can't see carbon dioxide or carbon molecules, but we'll talk about a few things that regulate this cycle. And just like the rock cycle, this can happen in lots of different orders. But what I want to point out is there's, on this diagram, some ways that carbon is absorbed. So we can talk about, if you want to just simplify it and think about carbon dioxide, ways that carbon dioxide is absorbed or taken out of a system. And then there's ways that carbon dioxide is being released into the atmosphere. So these are the two things we're going to talk about. So naturally, carbon dioxide is released from volcanoes. So there are some people that say that they don't believe that humans are contributing to the current state of CO2 increasing in the atmosphere. Some people say, a very small amount of people say, that they think it's from volcanic activity. I don't agree. The numbers don't match up. There's not enough volcanic activity to account for all the extra CO2 that's in the atmosphere, and we can physically measure all the CO2 coming out of power plants, so we know that we're contributing to the increase in carbon in the atmosphere. But these scientists, these very small percentage, less than 1%, that say that volcanic activity is what's driving the current climate change, they are correct that volcanoes do contribute CO2 to the atmosphere. Of course, we've talked about combustion and burning of fossil fuels. Also, what if we are breathing out, right? That's putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So we've got respiration. And then there's lots of different ways that, I'm not going to talk about all these other ones, it gets a little complicated. There's lots of ways that you can use up CO2, so it can be absorbed. So lots of ways that you can use it up naturally. So it's obviously being used right here by these forests, by photosynthesis. So plants are using it, taking it in. Weathering of rocks actually uses up a lot of CO2, the natural processes that break down rocks. So there's lots of chemical equations we could do for that, but it does use up a lot of CO2. The oceans themselves are actually taking in CO2 and holding it under pressure, especially the deep ocean. If you've ever opened a soda and heard that shh, that's actually a release of CO2. It's under pressure in your can. And atmospheric CO2 is actually being held under pressure inside the ocean. And if the ocean is, the deep ocean is very cold and it can hold a lot of CO2. And the more the ocean gets warmed up, it can't hold as much CO2 as it usually does. So the ocean is one way that the carbon cycle is regulated. Also, if we look at the equation for creating limestone, my favorite sedimentary rock, the rock that's made from coral reefs and fossils of all different kinds from the ocean, that rock is actually created with this molecule right here. Let me find a really fun color. Calcium carbonate. So this has a lot of, when this forms, the chemical equation actually uses up CO2 to create this molecule, calcium carbonate. So it's actually stored in limestone. So this is showing coral reef CO2 being held in the limestone. And here's a layer of limestone in here. So coral reefs are actually using it up. Any kind of shell creature is using it up and storing it in limestone. So that's kind of cool. Another way that these gases are being released into the atmosphere, or a way that they're sourced naturally, is from animal digestion. So here's one over here showing these cows over here and showing that they're breathing out methane. So these cows' digestion actually produces a lot of methane, and then they release it back into the atmosphere. And so there's naturally cows on Earth. You know, that's not just a human thing. There's some different species, especially in Asia and Africa, that naturally live on Earth. But we obviously have a lot more cows than we used to because people are farming them for dairy cows and meat. So there's a lot more cows. So that's producing a lot of extra methane as well. So here's a summary slide that has some of these different things. One thing that I didn't talk about, so sources, these are ways that CO2 gets into the atmosphere. And sinks are the ways that CO2 is used up, like we talked about on the previous slide. One thing I didn't talk about is, what if you have limestone? This has taken in a lot of CO2, and then it subducts under tectonic plates. Sorry, this is kind of cut off. But if you subduct that at a convergent boundary under the tectonic plate, that's going to take the limestone down deep into the earth. That's a great place to store CO2. So that's a really good thing if you have ocean floor going up underneath continental crust. You're going to have storage of CO2 for a long time.